This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that my book, Drummers on Drumming, is available now on Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Based on the Big Fat 5 segment of this podcast, where I sit down with my favorite drummers to discuss the 5 records and stories that shaped their approach to the instrument, this book is packed with insights from the drummers who redefined how we think about the modern drum set. You can grab your copy now by checking the link in this episode's show notes or simply searching Drummers on Drumming on Amazon. So thank you for all the support, and now let's get into the show. What is up? Welcome back to Drummers on Drumming, a podcast powered by Big Fat Snare Drum. My name is Ben Hilsinger, and this is a re-airing of a pretty old episode. So Terry Keating is the host of the Bonzolium YouTube channel, and he is a ball of energy. I love him. I love the channel, and he is my go-to source of anything Bonzo related. And so, gosh, maybe 5-6 years ago, I had him on the show to originally talk about 5 less familiar Bonzo tracks that showcase the uniqueness that is Bonzo. And we eventually get there, but Terry's the kind of person that you just put a quarter in and he goes. And I don't do a lot of talking this episode. I was along the ride with him. So I hope you guys enjoy this. We go all over the place, and Terry's energy is infectious. So I wanted to put this towards the top of the feed because last time I released it, it was one of our most popular episodes. So have fun and go check out the Bonzolium YouTube channel. Cheers and buckle up.
So have you always been? I mean, was Bonzo your dude from day one?
Well, the funny thing is that I actually, growing up, when I was really, really little, my dad was pretty hip, and especially for his age. I mean, right now he's 85. But yeah, we were growing up. He had Beatles records. He had all the Beatles records. He had Pink Floyd. We had some Monkees. We had the Monkees records, and we had Elton John and that kind of stuff, you know. So when I was first listening to music, I would put on actually Elton John records. And I'd be really little, and I'd be listening to them on the headphones. And that was really good for to pick up harmonies. But what happened was then I got into the Stones, and then my cousin listened to the Stones, and then my brother had Zeppelin albums. He had Zeppelin, he had the first Zeppelin record, the second, the third, the fourth, and the song remains the same. And then I think I went out and I bought Physical Graffiti and In Through the Outdoor and Presence. So I was probably 10 or 11 by the time I first got into Zepp. And I remember the thing that really, I mean, the songs were kind of cool and stuff, but when I started listening to the live vinyl, the song remains the same soundtrack, the version of No Quarter, and it's funny, Jimmy Page, ever since they released that, ever since 76, the movie came out, the soundtrack came out, kind of starting after the first remaster, the first remaster to CD, he probably left it the same, but pretty much after that, he started editing the No Quarter shorter to make it fit with the movie, because the soundtrack's a little different, the audio than the movie, with how they're playing it in the movie, in the film that they took from the show, and it's just butchered, and it's just the way Bonham plays on it, and that's what really turned me on to the Paistes too, the 2002s, just how they sounded. I remember looking at the pictures and seeing the word Paiste underneath the cymbal, or Paiste, I was like, God, what the fuck? And going to music stores, and they'd be like, oh yeah, here they are, and I'd be like, whoa. But it was pretty much the live, commercially available, just that record that kind of turned me on them. I really got the Moby Dick was crazy, the No Quarter, and then I went back and I started listening to the records. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
So that's kind of how it went. I actually sort of was sucked into it by listening to that Song Remains the Same on vinyl, and just listen how they interplayed and how Bonham was just, he just really has a really. It's funny. I know people say, Ginger Baker used to say, the late Ginger Baker, that Bonham couldn't swing a sack of shit. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, he really could. I mean, now the accurate statement might be he probably couldn't play jazz to save his, or jazz proper. Like he couldn't sound and be like ding 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 bump maybe, but he didn't like jazz so much, I think. But he could swing. I mean, he could swing definitely better than Ginger Baker could. I mean, if you listen to, there's some clips of Ginger Baker playing jazz where it's all right. In the early 60s when he was coming up in London, the jazz they were playing there, he was probably, from what they were used to listening to, he was probably great. You know what I mean? So he got to be known as this jazz drummer that went into Cream, But Bonham really has just a way about his playing where he swings kind of everything in a certain way, but he also has the ability to hold the time. It's hard to explain. Like a lot of younger drummers today, I ask them, like students I've had, so if I say, when you listen to the first 30 seconds of When the Levee Breaks, you can hear it in there. The tempo moves a little. It slows down a little at points and stuff. But since I'm on the other, like most people kind of who really started listening to music and the radio by the time, especially maybe people born in maybe 1985 and after, maybe 1982 and after, all the music they would that would be new to them was all edited together heavily via a click track or straight up quantized. So I wonder how the younger kids today, when they hear that stuff, if it sounds like it's totally fucked up, or if they feel the musicness of it. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's a whole thing I've put in videos that I've talked about, the concept of like perfect time. I mean, if you're a pop band or an electronic band or something, by default, given the nature of the style, you probably want perfect metronomic time, But I hear all these stories, like engineers, like they're in the studio and producers, and the band comes in, they're like, oh, great song, what's the BPM? And they're like, oh, it's 86. All right, great. And they put that right in. Well, you don't want a bad performance. I mean, you don't want to give anybody an excuse for playing like shit. But, there are, human beings are, we're analog, so even, is something to be said, sometimes in verses, generally in the music we've become, familiar with the verses, you might pull back a little in the choruses, you might just pick up a teeny bit. But all that stuff is really, for lack of it's organic. But I have been trying to be a proponent of people to, practice by all means to metronomes. Make sure you can, do meter and certain things, and you're able to play things consistently at certain speeds and stuff. But I'm hoping sort of the trend comes back to like recorded music and stuff where people really learn to rely on their individual sense of time. Because, the dimension of slightly speeding up or slowing down, it's actually one of the ingredients we have in music, just like pitches or timbre or, whatever the hell you're playing on or loudness or softness, I don't even know how the hell I got off on that tangent.
No, I love it, man. Do you have confirmation that they normally never played with the click?
Well, the funny thing is the click, I would say from listening to it, I think the only thing conceivably that would resemble a click track in Led Zeppelinville would be in the middle part of Whole Lotta Love, where that hi-hat's going. I think what probably happened was they might have looped that. You know what I mean? Like I think that was like, have you ever heard like Moby Dick? If you listen when they recorded Moby Dick, the studio version, when you hear that intro, da 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 da. They recorded the intro and the outro at one studio, and then at another studio they recorded the solo.
Okay.
Then they just, you know what I mean? So they were able to edit. I mean, Jimmy Page was the master of editing. He was really good at, cobbling stuff together. But I'd be fairly certain that I don't think absolutely no quantization, obviously. They really didn't happen until the late 90s. But I don't think there's anything where he was listening to a click track at all. I think that, bands like that, sometimes they used to make click tracks in the sense that, like, to keep it together. Like, I think, like, Ramble On. Do you know how during the song you hear the like that noise? It's like bottom, like a guitar case or something. I think stuff like that used to happen all the time, just as the band. So if they were going to track a song that the drums were going to come in on, the drummer would play something that they'd hear in their headphone that they'd be playing along to, but you just wouldn't hear it in the final mix. That concept of a click track where he was the metronome maybe while they were playing, but I don't think there's any artificial. I don't think there's any click track in Zeppelin. I think what used to happen with click tracks and stuff was back in the 50s when they would be scoring movies. Somehow they would use the click track to line up the audio sync with the video, with the film sync. Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't necessarily they felt the drummer had shit time or the band had shit time. But I think what started to happen too is the mindset in the 60s that of songs, not wanting to speed up or slow down at least too much. But the fact of the matter is if a drummer needs a click track to play well, they're not going to be good enough to play with the click track well, kind of. Kind of the whole style of a lot of younger drummers today, it's a chops fest, which is, I admire the hell out of it, but it's almost like they just put on, it's almost like, do you ever take karate?
I didn't. My brother did, but...
Okay, karate, they have things called katas, right? So for like 30 seconds, like a dance where you do this and you do that. So you practice these certain movements. It's almost like in drums now, there's like, okay, well, check this one out. You go singles and a paradiddle to the hi-hat and to the bass drum. And then that lasts like a bar long, and people practice that till they get really good at it, and then they can loop it. And then sometimes when they're playing songs and stuff, they almost think of it like, okay, I'm going to throw that pre-programmed fill in, as opposed to playing right from your viscera.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying, I'm sure there's many, many younger drummers that's not true, where they do play from their viscera, but those things just come out, But it does seem like in a certain way that drumming anyway has really almost become more like a musical yoga to like a click track. Drumming is if you're sitting there and everyone's playing a song and you don't have a guitar and you're just clapping your hands. That's what drumming is. But wait, let me set that bass drum up. That's what you're doing, I mean, if and that's the thing I never really understood about like, I remember when I sort of first was introduced with like the concept of digital. When digital recording came in, I remember way back in the day, they used to have ADAT tapes. They almost looked like video cassettes. Mm-hmm. So it was tape, but it was stored via, zeros and ones. And then I remember Pro Tools came out, and there was a guy that we had worked with at a studio in Chicago who became familiar with Pro Tools real early. And they used to joke around, they call him Pro Toolius, which I thought was pretty funny. And he flew out to California and made a lot of money in the early days when Pro Tools first came out. And he was telling me about all kinds of like auto-tune things. Like they have to sign contracts if like person X can't sing and those types of things. Mm. Like they have the Pravy duty. They're like, we'll sue you, And but I remember going in and sort of sitting down there, we're tracking something. He's like, Terry, would you come in? I want you to play drums on something. He's like, I kind of play, but so he went in and he played, and it was like doom da 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 doom bada boom boom. And I was like, well, it sounds kind of rudimentary, but it sounds a little weird, but it sounds solid. He goes, well, that's because I quantized it. And I was like, oh, and that was the first time. That was probably 99 maybe. And I think in those days, there was a time when you could manually quantize. Mm-hmm. Like I know you can still do it now if you really need to. But now it's pretty much plug and play, I guess. But, you really hear it. Like it's like perfect time when it comes to certain soundscapes and certain chords. And part of the thing is, this is why I said before to like younger kids, if you listen to certain Zeppelin songs, or especially Stone songs, and you hear the tempo get all funky, does it sound good, bad, or sloppy? But it could also be said that people like me, or maybe people like you, that when we grew up in an era where it wasn't perfect, we just got used to that. Saying like people could say that, well, somebody might, a valid argument, well, whether or not it's ultimately valid, but they could certainly say in a court of law, like, listen, dinosaur, you're just fucking used to shit sounding like shit. And somebody could say that, But I'm fairly certain that if you were to do something where and I'm dead serious about this, I saw an experiment years and years ago where they had a bunch of plants and they blasted heavy metal from the speakers at it. And it was like thrash metal, like jigga, 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 jigga. So I'm sure they were playing to a click and stuff. And after a few days, the plants started to lean away from the speakers, and they started to kind of shrivel up and not do all that well. But then what they did was then they started playing like, it wasn't so much whether it was sequenced or not, or click tracked or not, but like softer, like the Eagles and stuff, or like, God, what did they actually play? Like Jim Croce or something. And the plants actually started to lean toward it. So it's almost like in the universe, it's almost like because music, I think, affects people so viscerally, that sometimes, and I'm talking about an extremely exact, for the song's 5 minutes, where it's exactly going to be 73 beats per minute the whole time. And if the song is kind of if you have like a loop of chorus where it's like, we're really happy in happy chords, we're really happy in, you might not notice if it's perfect time. Do you know what I mean? But if you start making little transitions from like happy, happy, then we get kind of minory. I think that at times like that, the tempo is a useful tool to very slightly make transitions into things like that. And again, it's very subtle and it's very small. Like it doesn't have to be a major retard or I don't even know the terms they use, retardando or allegro or whatever the fuck. I mean, I remember those terms from years ago.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But that's the thing kind of about Zeppelin, though, is that Zeppelin almost seemed to have, it's not, and again, it's not necessarily even just the sound of Bonham's drums, but it's definitely the way that it's almost like he was the conductor of Zeppelin.
Sure.
He was playing a drum set, where he was up there like this, but playing. And I even theorize sometimes, I wonder if it's possible sometimes with Bonham, because I want to do this I wanted to do it with my own music anyway, just because I'm one person, I can't play instruments. What I was going to do is I was going to play, and I'm still going to do this, I'm going to make up songs. So I'm going to record the drums and make up a song on the spot as I play it for 5 minutes. And it's going to be a song in the sense it won't necessarily have a chorus and a bridge, that type of thing. But it'll be just like 5 minutes of music. So then I'm going to go back and I'm going to overdub what I sang and then overdub it again. And then once I have that basics, it's almost like a click track, a melodic click track that I sang. I then can have actual instruments overdubbed and then keep the original drum take. But I wonder if sometimes when Zeppelin used to record stuff, if Bonham used to just go in and play it by himself, and then if the guys would just overdub their stuff on it. Like, I don't think that really actually happened, but that's almost kind of what it's like. You feel like when Bonham comes in sometimes, he starts playing the drums, almost always he'll come in and he's very slightly dragging, but it doesn't sound like he's dragging. And two things happen. He's not too extreme, but also too, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones play exactly to him. There's just a way about it. Like, I've just never really heard that type of, it's almost like some people get it and some people don't. But there's years and years ago, I used to buy and sell musical. Like I used to, in the days before the internet, before like vintage drum got kind of popular and hip and cool and stuff. I got into sort of collecting drums sort of by accident. I learned in the early 80s, I had this old Japanese kit that was painted black. I don't even know what the manufacturer was. And then I needed a kit to play because I was going to kind of start playing with some bands. So I'm like, well, I better have an actual kit that I could. So I bought a Pearl Export set, it was probably like a mid 80s Pearl Export set. In the 80s they had the long logs. So it was one of those.
Yep.
And then the early 90s rolled around and I can't remember what was I watching? I was watching some show where there was an old Ludwig green sparkle kit that this guy was playing. I remember being like, oh, kind of like, Bonham's old green sparkles, because I'd have all the books and I'd look at them. But I never, even because of Zeppelin or anything all through the 80s or the Who or whatever I was listening to at the time, I never really had the fetish to go out and buy one of those kits. But then what happened so I decided to, in Chicago, there was a paper and it was like an ad paper, where you could buy and sell shit. It was called Trading Times. And in the early mid 80s, man, people were like, all the drummers in the late 70s, early 80s were making the switch from American drums to Japanese drums. So they were selling all their Ludwig, Rogers, Slingerland, Camco, and they were buying all their Tama, Pearl, Yamaha. You know what I mean? So you would see, pages of pages. I remember looking in this thing and like Rogers, Red Onyx, Rogers, Swivemat, and they were giving it away. I'm telling you, man, I wish I'd kept even just a couple of those. They'd be worth money, just the paper.
Sure, yeah.
To show you like, oh my God, somebody's selling. It'd say like matching Dynasonic, $500, Zildjian cymbal, But anyway, so what happened was I saw that and I'm like, I'm going to get my hands on an old drum set. So I went out for the first time in a long time. I hadn't really picked up a Trading Times since about 87 or 8. So I went out, this was 92 maybe, and I picked up a Trading Times. I was looking through it and I'm like, wow, there's not as much old cool stuff in here, but there's a few things, And I saw this lady was selling a Ludwig drum set, $350. Or this person was selling it. So I called her. She was an old lady. She was maybe 70, 75. Her husband had passed away about 15 years, 20 years before. I remember her name. Her name was Josephine Alangi. And she's like, you know what? She's like, I just got around to being able to sell these now. Like she didn't want to sell them, So I went and I looked, and it was a 22, 13, 16 Blue Oyster Pearl. So Ringo, but blue, a Superphonic, Hi-hats were old 15-inch, like transition stamp, you'd call them now zillions.
Yeah.
The ride was a 20-inch 602, it was probably like maybe like 1,920 gram. The crash was an old zillion. There were all kinds of cowbells and temple blocks and shit and all kinds of stuff. And so I said, listen, here's the 350. I'm going to send you some more money. I got home and I sent her a check for like $400 or something, because I knew in those days, you knew what that shit went for, you know? So what happened is then after I got that, I was like, that was kind of cool. You know what I mean? I ended up selling the cymbals off. I'm like, wow, I just sold all those cymbals for like $400 and I'm only like $200 or $300. Now, what did I end up in the end paying her for it? I might have given her $350, and to be honest, it might have just been another $300. I mean, at the time, I didn't have much money, you know. There wasn't the internet; that it was liquid.
Yeah.
Throw it on Reverb, you know. You literally had to like frickin', you know, move it. And but then after that, I found an old Red Sparkle Club date, and then I found this, and so then I befriended this collector who said, "You're down south, you know, you talk like this, Terry." He's like, "What you got to do?" He goes, "Put an ad in the paper, put in old drummer seeks old drums." And so I did. And then, man, people would call you with stuff. And it was great because, you know, you'd find stuff that people were selling. You didn't have to go out and look for it. There'd be a bummer sometimes, though, because you talk to some, you'd be like, what's the finish like? And they'd say, well, it's this kind of this swirly thing. They tell you they're Ludwig on the. So you drive 2.5 hours and you get there. And it was a hunk of shit, you know, piece of shit set that had a Ludwig bass drum head on the front of it.
Yeah.
But you won some and you lost some, you know. But that was kind of the way to do it, you know. That's anyway. So when that happened, I started getting into the drums, into buying and selling. And where I was going with it was when I would then buy and sell from people who were musicians. I started talking. You know, eventually I'd start talking about Zeppelin, and they'd be like, "Oh my God," you know. And we'd start talking like you'd be like, "Yeah, on this record when Bonham, oh my God, when he does this," or you talk about Madison Square. And I realized I'm like, God, there's a whole lot of people out there that are really like almost like as crazy as I am with Zeppelin, like all the time. So then it dawned on me when I started doing the YouTube videos that a lot of those people seem to find the channel. So like a lot of, you know, there's a huge like John Bonham Zeppelin, and it even goes with Jimmy Page Zeppelin and John, you know, there's just a huge thing to Zeppelin. Watch, it turns out to be that the guys did make a pact with the devil. And then, you know, they always talk about, you know, Zeppelin made a pact with the devil, and that's why everybody's attracted to it. But there's just really, for lack of a better word, really a true mojo with Zeppelin that really seems to really center on Bonham. Because, you know, if you listen to Jimmy Page playing with other bands, it doesn't sound Zeppelin-y. You know, the chords kind of do because it's Jimmy Page's, you know, he has those, you know, strange chords and the tunings he likes. And then, you know, John Paul Jones too. But Bonham really sort of was almost like a Wagnerian Germanic drummer. You know, like real, like almost bombastic, but bombastic in a really sort of clever way. Like one thing Bonham never did is he never overdid anything. Live, you'll hear him overdo a couple things, but it sounds cool because they're killing it.
It's live, yeah.
But in studio versions, if you think to almost every Led Zeppelin song, there's always one little fill or one little thing Bonham does that's just so cool. And so I do always try to talk to people about, you know, it's hard to sort of pinpoint the exact record you want to give somebody to sort of get into Zeppelin. But you know, I don't know. So that I guess where I was going with all the buying and selling stuff was just that I realized there were a lot of diehard Bonham Zeppelinites out there.
Why do you think people are so obsessed with his gear so much?
I think part of the thing is that you get with Bonham is the way he tuned a snare drum. Mm-hmm. Bonham had a way of tuning a snare drum, kind of whatever drum it was. Like when you listen to the first record, from what there's no pictures taken of, but I understand it's a 5x14 superphonic. You know what I mean? But the way he played, like he used rim shots, and he'd get the snare wires to where they were just be, you know, they weren't super duper tight. He'd use a tone control. But you know, you bring up something that to this day I've been kind of trying to answer. But the thing is even I'm that guy. Like I was always interested in the gear, and my big thing now, interest with Zeppelin now is kind of like, where is his gear now? Like one thing I'd love to do would be able to put together like a documentary. You know, we fly to England and we start like, you know, well, there's a rumor that here in this Easy High, you know, you could almost make like a Monty Python kind of joke out of it. But yeah, that really seems to be the gear. And I think or the question, I think so much of it really is the sound Bonham got. And, you know, people's nature is, oh, that's the sound. Well, it must be the gear. You know what I mean? Oh, and if it wasn't the snare drum, what, Eddie Kramer, for the love of God, what mics were you using? And Eddie Kramer's all the time, he always says the same thing. And they're like, listen, Bonham played the way he did. Wouldn't have made a difference if I had, a U87 in the corner as opposed to AKG or whatever the frick it was. Now with the internet, since the internet's really come up, the past 20 years, there's a lot more pictures and clips that are showing up. But, up until the year 2000, man, pictures and live clips and stuff of Zeppelin were really hard to find. That's probably one of the most concretely interesting things, at least that a non-Zeppelin person would even be interested in listening to a conversation of, like, what is so important about the gear? It seems like the only people that remotely approach Bonham, and the people being so, inquisitive about the gear, is Ringo, Stuart Copeland, and then Keith Moon too a little, But those columns would be this big. Ringo's would be a little bigger, and Copeland's would be a little bigger. But, Bonham's would stretch to the ceiling. It'd be nice if you maybe interviewed me and George. The funny thing about George is, I have to tell you about George. This freaking guy, 25 years ago I met him. I bought a snare stand from him that I still actually have, which I should give back to him. I should just give it back. But it's a Sonar snare stand, and it's like an old Horsch Link, 1971. It's probably made out of what do they say, manganese steel, and you could probably throw it in salt water, probably wouldn't even rust. It weighs 1,000 pounds, and there's all kinds of levers and shit on it. And but the neat thing about it is the 3 feet are retractable, like you'd see on bass drum spurs. So if you want, it can sit on its rubber legs, but if you want, you can screw the rubber things up and the spike comes out. And the reason why I bought it was because at the time I was playing Moby Dick. And the thing is, when you're playing, with your hands like that, I didn't realize at the time that Bonham, they used to set his drums up on a big, huge plywood, probably thicker than, it must have been frickin' 3/4 or more even, where then they would drill holes into, because he'd set it up the exact same every time. So even the cymbal stands wouldn't have the rubber feet. They'd slots, they'd fit right. So even if you hit it, it wouldn't move. So when you play with your hands, like the snare, it bounces. You know what I mean? Like if you start playing hard with your hands, the floor tom will start moving away from you, or the snare might even start moving away from you, even tip over. But anyway, so I brought this snare stand from him, 25 years ago. And George, God love him, man. We're pretty much about the same age, but he's a flat. He started playing drums when he was 4. His dad was a jazz drummer. His dad really encouraged him to get into Zeppelin and stuff. So he's a dyed-in-the-wool Zeppelin guy, card-carrying Zeppelinite probably from the time he was 9. So what happened was he then got into jazz drums too, and then he studied drums. I don't know if he studied straight up at college for it, but he took lessons from some diehards. Let me put it this way: if a jazz person was going to come into Chicago with their guy, and the guy or gal or whomever got sick, George would, I'm sure, be in the top 3 who would get called. He met Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and John Paul Jones. Do you remember when they were the Kennedy Center honors back in 2012? Obama was there, and they got awards and stuff. Well, the reception ball afterward, George was in the house, was in the big band playing. So he got to run around and talk to those guys,
Oh my God!
But so what happened was, anyway, long story short, I bought the stand from him. When I met him, it was all cat, and it was all jazz. Hey man, you'll love this stand. These cat. It was real jazz lingo-y. And I was such a candy ass. I was playing, just jamming and playing with a couple bands, and I felt, So some years went by, and I think I saw him once out. I'm like, dude, I know, hey, what's going on? How's that snare? Good, But about 4 years ago, I forgot what happened. George probably stumbled upon, he was probably looking up something Zeppelin on YouTube, and sure enough, he probably saw me like this, and he's probably like, who's this freaking Jamoke, And he looks up, he's like, I know that guy. I recognize that guy. So we watched some of the videos, and then he sent me an email. It's like, Terry, it's George, and I was taught the snare stand, blah, blah, blah. So finally I said, well, listen, man, if you ever get a chance, you got to come over. I have, the drums in the basement. I got all kinds of gear and shit if you're looking for anything. He's like, absolutely. So one day he came over. Remember, he came in, and what did he bring? He brought a couple things. He brought some Paiste. Terry, check these out and stuff. It was going to be a geek day. So I'm like, why don't you sit down at the drums, Now, here's the thing. A couple things. There are a lot of times, whether he's a jazz drummer, whomever, they're a great drummer or known as a drummer, but they go down to play Zeppelin, and you and a lot of people know, it's kind of a different animal. even though it might be in good time and it's the same stuff he's playing, it just doesn't sound like it. Or especially if they're a jazz drummer, sometimes if they play any rock, it sounds really unbalanced. Fucking George goes and he sits down at the drums. He looks at me, and I forgot what he started playing first. And I was like, Jesus Christ, this is the fucking reincarnation. I'm telling you, this freaking guy, George Flutist, can play exactly like Bonham. The touch, the fills, the technique. Not only that, he can tune. When George Flutist makes a video on a song from the album Presence, he'll tune the drums, because Bonham would have slightly different tunings, and sometimes they'd be in a really ambient room, and sometimes they might not be. He would literally he can make the drums, not just the snare or the toms or the bass drum, sound as close as possible to the recording and mix proper. I don't know how the fuck he does it. And he is really one of the only people, he's the only person. It takes me a little while to tune my snare drum Bonham style. George will sit down on anybody's snare drum, and within 2 or 3 minutes, it will sound like Bonham's snare drum. And I told him he could have a business, man. You could say, send me your snare drum, pay for shipping there and back, and $50. I'll tune your snare drum just like Bonham, and I'll frickin' mail it back to you. It's just amazing how he pulls it off. And plus, God, he knows 10 times more about Bonham's history, about Zeppelin's history. You could be talking to him, he'd be like, yeah, that show from 72, in Copenhagen, and the third song, or when you talk to a sports person, and they're like, yeah, Mickey Rogers back in 53 when he batted .376. And somebody's like, yeah, man, the following year, Floyd Cott. You're like, dudes, who gives a shit? But with Zeppelin, you and me, we'd eat it up. But he's like that, man. He's heard every bootleg 1,000 times. I'm telling you, really, with George, it sounds like Bonham. It's like Men in Black, where he pulls the skin off that guy and he's stuck.
Sure, yeah.
That's George, man. At some point, you got to have him on, too. But there's a couple interesting things, too, where you hear – I think there's a fair amount of drummers and musicians that aren't a Bonham or even Zeppelin precisely for the thing we were talking about before, because they've only heard the 7 songs you hear all the time. Mm-hmm. Immigrant Song, Stairway to Heaven, Rock and Roll, Fool in the Rain, you know what I mean? But if you really listen to Zeppelin stuff, other musicians, especially drummers, would really, I think, learn to appreciate if they listen, if they really sit and listen. Again, it's the technical facility, especially as it relates to those days. Like nowadays, a lot of people consider a lot of technique when you do you string sort of together those doubles, and even drummers been playing 3 or 4 years now are able to get like ththose drop catch 3 notes, like
Yep.
Which is I can't. But in those, like Bonham, really the way he played was, you can tell that I don't know how many lessons he ever had, but you can tell there were like 5 rudiments that he really, really, you can tell he played all the time, and he'd always bring into the music. And that was like the paradiddle, the double paradiddle, the paradiddle diddle, the single stroke and the buzz. And he also had sort of it was like a double paradiddle diddle kind of thing, where it'd be 9 notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you'd go. So a paradiddle diddle would be right, left, left, 1 and 2 and but you go right, left, left, right, left. So you put a right, left, right before a paradiddle diddle, and you play that fast around the drums, and that's so much of the cool shit Bonham's doing at the Royal Albert Hall when you see him doing Moby Dick, and he's sitting there, he's behind his maple drums. That's one of the fills he's doing. And it really is amazing. And that's why, somebody like George, one of the many reasons why George can pull it off is because George has that straight up old school technical proficiency. And Bonham used to also do this frickin' thing too. I don't know how the hell. He used to do a thing. He'd play double strokes, but he'd play them real lightly, like he'd almost like barely touch the head. And he'd play them so fast. It was French grip style. And they sound like buzz rolls, and you don't hear it much later, but you hear it. You hear it on the first record. You hear it all over like live recordings from like '69 and '70, but it's a real fast single stroke roll that sounds like a buzz. So it's like, and there'd be time I talk about videos. And I remember there was this guy, and I looked him up. He had a few videos, but he was like kind of a renowned in Europe somewhere. He's a jazz drummer. And he's like, sorry, Terry, you're mistaken. Those are buzz rolls. So what I did was I said, well, listen, if you go back and you look at some of these clips, like the Danish TV, they're playing in like March of '68, or the Super Show right around that time, and you can see Bonham. You can actually see him do it, man. And this guy sent me an email back. He's like, man, I thought you were foolish. He's like, you're right, man. I don't know how this freaking guy could do it. And a lot of people can play those singles real fast, but he had the ability to sort of pull them. Like, it almost seems like he could have done that same thing on Pillows. He didn't even necessarily really seem to need the rebound so much, but it was really like, but it was just so fast. And the impact, you didn't even really hear the impact of the head. It almost made the snare wires just go. I don't know how the fuck he did it. One thing about the gear and part of the thing is with Jimmy Page is very intelligent. He knows, like, supply, like, I mean, I think part of the gig, you know, I've always been begging him and other people, like, if he could, you know, you ever seen that book about the Beatles? Somebody that worked at EMI, that worked at Abbey Road, that was sick. I think they had cancer and they were going through treatment. So the EMI people were like, listen, man, you can come in here. We're going to pay you one way or the other. You don't even have to come in if you don't want. You don't have to work here. You can just ask around the studio, whatever you want to do. So what he did was he asked if he could go through all the Beatles tapes. Because, you know, remember, in those days, man, they used to, you know, record. I mean, a lot of these bands with tapes, sometimes they do like 100 takes of a song. And sometimes they'd say, all right, well, let's take the first 30 seconds of take 28. And then the next 40 seconds from take 40. You know, in a band like that, you know, with musicianship, like with Ringo, so it's really good. There's not going to be any tempo issues. You know what I mean? I'm sure it was the same Bonham too. And so he went through and he wrote a book like, okay, well, this song, you know, they recorded these tracks this day. They made what did they used to call a reduction? They call it a reduction now when they would take the 3 or 4 takes and they put it, and then that would be the master take.
Oh, okay.
And I always say, wouldn't it be great if somebody could do with Zeppelin stuff, you know? But I think there's a reason, you know, Jimmy Page wasn't a huge fan of like the press, so there weren't a whole lot of articles and stuff. But I think there certainly is a mystique of Led Zeppelin-dom, whether it's, you know, Jimmy's production style and capabilities or Bonham's equipment, or that I think Jimmy Page really knowingly keeps going. And God love him, you know what I mean? I think he really, you know, the more mystery to it, because there's mystery to it, you know, like you're kind of like, God, how the frick did they get that sound? Or, and I'm sure Jimmy Page had a lot of techniques that I think sometimes they'd track stuff and then they'd slow it down a little, and then he might retrack the guitars and the bass or play, you know what I mean? So I think there's a relatively good amount of Led Zeppelin stuff where the drums you're hearing, well, maybe not out of their whole catalog, but definitely on like Zeppelin 2, and Zeppelin and like Houses the Holy, and maybe some stuff on 4, and where the drums, you know, on the tape machine, you can just slow the tape machine down a little bit. And with the drums, it'll be, you know, each discrete note, instead of just being like a little mound like this, the slower you get, it fattens it. Ba becomes, you know what I mean? Like it thickens the sound up. I think that was a little, some of the secrets to sometimes Bonham's, the sound they get on some stuff, and maybe like the crunge. But anyway, as it goes to Bonham, I think something that'd be great that Jimmy Page would be able to do, if he could go back and find all the, like at least for The Song Remains the Same, you know, they shot footage at Baltimore before they did those 3 New York shows. Plus at New York, there's all kinds of, you know, I'm sure they had all kinds of film footage of cameras that might just happen with Ben Bonham on this part or on that part, because there's just so very few clips of where you can really see Bonham for an extended period of time. The stuff from 75 at Earl's Court there is, but that was videotaped. So I don't think there's a dedicated, I think what they recorded was what the director had fed into the main feed. So the only thing they have is, like, if you see Bonham playing Dazed Confused and there's 6 points in that tape where you see him play something, you can't go back and get the Bonham feed. You know what I mean? I think what was recorded was the main thing they had in the house, you know?
Sure.
Well, but The Song Remains the Same. There's got to be all kinds of strings of footage. But you know what I mean? So, but it would be really great, because the funny thing about Bonham when he plays, like you'll see some stuff from Nebworth, you know, where he's playing, like there's some pretty good stuff from Nebworth, but again, it goes back to Jimmy Page, Robert Plant. The Danish TV is great because there's pretty much all of them the whole time, more or less. There's some close-ups of, you know, but you see Bonham kind of the whole time. But it's funny, the way he played, he didn't look like he was playing what you were hearing. Sort of a weird way kind of sitting, and he held the sticks. He choked up a lot. But it's just really interesting. And what's funny about it is with the funny thing, a sort of a neat after effect of the Bonham thing, is it does seem to really bring, I mean, there is like a Bonham club, man. I mean, there are diehard Bonham Zeppelinites. Like I joke around the videos, I say, man, we could fill Madison Square Garden, but we probably freaking could. You know what I mean? Get like a 10-hour day, everybody's in there, they get all busted up. You get all these, Elon Rubin, get him in there. You know, you get George in there. I'd love to go. You know, we get all of us in there and we just, go up there and just talk Bonham stuff and play and just go berserker. Try to find his freaking gear, find out what happened to all these drums and cymbals. We try to get Jason Bonham on board to go along with this. Because it really is. It's so funny. Like I said back when I was talking about the collecting days, it's almost like you find yourself almost talking to like it's like the exact same, like you can say to them, yeah, like the snare drum sound. They're like, yeah, and they just know. It's just amazing, And George, too, my friend Bob, who I call Paiste Bob, who's he's a drummer, keyboard player, and a bass player. He's a huge Paiste and cymbal collector and has all kinds of cymbals. He should probably write a book on them. But again, man, you can just talk, time like stands still. You can start talking about Zeppelin. Suddenly it's 3 hours later. You're like, oh my God.
Blowing ad budget on metrics that look great till the CFO sees them. That's bull spend. And marketers are calling it out in Dashboard Confessions.
I remember telling my boss, it'll be good for the brand, when leads were slow. Yeah, it wasn't.
Cut the bull spend. LinkedIn lets you target by company, job title, and more. Advertise on LinkedIn. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a $250 credit. Go to linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
I don't know if he was necessarily a gearhead in the sense that, he might, let's say if you were to talk to like Cozy Powell or something, be like, hey man, what do you think? You see the Slingerlands that come out now, they blow or something like that. But I do know that they do say he was very careful with his gear. Like I remember reading an article or a book, again, this is way before the internet, where John Paul Jones was talking about how, he'd lovingly see John Bonham washing his cymbals in soap and water. And there is an interesting thing, too, that Paiste Bob had pointed out to me.
I love Paiste Bob.
I swear to God, he's a great guy, too. And it's a clip of where they go to Scandinavia, and I'm not sure what year it is. If it's 72, maybe. There's an interesting clip there where you see the promoter sitting with Richard Cole, and the promoter opens the briefcase to show Richard Cole all the money they're about to pay. Cole freaks out and he slams it shut. It's really interesting stuff. But they show the band come in. They come in off the plane and they're sort of in the terminal at the airport. And Bonham walks up and you can actually hear him say, "Hey, somebody stole one of my cymbals." Like you can hear him say that. He's like, I forget how he says it. He's like, I'm missing one of my cymbals. But I think he was pretty careful. Like I do think in the Bonham book, his brother, I think Mick Bonham, the late Mick Bonham, wrote a book about his brother. I do think he talks about there too, where Bonham was really, he wasn't a Keith Moon trash the stuff kind of guy. I think he was very respectful of his instrument. Copeland was one of those guys who, even though he played tom and stuff, he didn't destroy his stuff, but he could. I remember reading an article from like 1980 where he's like, they're like, all right, well, Stuart Cole, tell us what you're playing now. He's like, well, we're playing all Paiste now, because he played Zildjian. There were Zildjians he'd have on the kid too. And he's like, I think my drums are, I think they're Wonder Stars. They're like lovely, like he doesn't even, Imperial Star, Superstar, some whatever star. He calls them Wonder Stars. But, there's a lot of drummers that are like that. Like Neil Peart, I remember reading an article where somebody had asked him in like the Modern Drummer, they still have Modern Drummer, but I don't know if they do anymore. I haven't really seen much of it. But they used to have a thing where you could ask questions to drummers like about their gear. And he had asked a question about Neil Peart's, like his cymbals. Oh, I really love your cymbal sound here and there and there. And Neil Peart replies, like, listen, he's like, all I know is I tell Zildjian, I say I want a couple bigger ones, a couple, and they send them to him. He's like, I couldn't tell you. He's like, I don't know if it's like a heavy crash or a thin crash. That's, this was, and so that article might have been 82, 83. So there's a fair amount of musicians, at least drummers, that are like that. I mean, I think sometimes with drums, plus there's so many, things with it. Like with the guitar, you're going to have a lot more gearheads with guitars and basses and keyboards because it's the one thing they're kind of going to have. That amp, you know what I mean? But yeah, Neil Peart was like that. I think there's a fair amount of drummers that are like that too. Like they'll always say, I don't know, the round and I hit him. You know what I mean? But that is interesting about Bonham. There was, and I want to say it might have been the same book or article I read. There was a time 2 years ago, and I haven't been able to find it, even with the internet, where John Paul Jones was talking about how Bonham used to cut up newspaper and put it in his bass drum. And when we look at that picture of George, George and I have obsessed over it as is Paiste Bob. There's a picture of them set up at Olympic when they're working on like Zeppelin 2 or 3, I forget, and the maple thermos are set up. It's got to be early though, because there's only one floor tom there, which it looks like the 18. And it looks like, if you look at the bass drum, it looks like, with light coming through that, there is like some either crumpled or cut up newspaper sitting in there. And I want to say that was something that I think was done by drummers, I mean, in general, because I want to say in all my collecting years, I even want to say that drum set, I was telling you the drum set about the Josephine Alonji, that first vintage kit I bought, there was newspaper in that, about that far up in it. You know what I mean? Well, it almost makes it like a soft gate in the sense that, like, if you have a strip or tape on it, it's like, but when you have newspaper in there, when it strikes, the newspaper is going to move a little bit. So you can get a little bit of resonance, and then when the newspaper settles, it puts the kibosh on it. So it's like boom. You know what I'm saying? Unless you have a busload of newspaper there. But yeah, but I think it was the same article where John Paul Jones talked about the newspaper and also talked about him washing his cymbals with soap in the bathtub. That's what he said. Bathtub, probably the first tour. We probably took it, because the funny thing is, I used to always, say, well, Bonham must have always tuned that drum himself just to get that consistency of sound. Like, I don't even know if you could really teach like a roadie or something to do that. And the funny thing is, there's a really telling photograph from 1975 where Bonham, he's standing. I'm sure you've probably seen it, where one of his roadies or his roadie, I don't know if it's Mick Hinton or who the hell it is, but he's standing there and he's wearing one of the, the movie A Clockwork Orange?
Yeah.
He's wearing like the Droog outfit, and he's holding the snare drum up for Bonham. Bonham has sticks. It's before the show, and he's like testing the drum out to make sure it sounds just so, So I do think Bonham was very much a hands-on. A lot of drums will just, like, they'll just show up and play, whatever. But I think Bonham, his drums would be set up, but he'd probably sit and he'd really go over everything. Because it really is amazing, the consistency, really, of like Bonham's, sound. You know what I mean? When you really listen to the first record and you listen to, it's a lot of it is the fact that snare drum, it is an aluminum, it's a Ludwig, like your Superphonic back there. And it is a rim shot, and the snares are on there just so, and the tone control. I used to see him play with the tone. Like, there's a cool thing when I used to listen to like Song Remains the Same and stuff. His snare drum always sounded so ringy when they get to Moby Dick. Just not necessarily ringy, but just more open. It sounded just a lot. It lasted longer each strike. And there's an interesting thing. One of the first things I noticed about the Royal Albert Hall footage was right before or right after Moby Dick. You see his hand come around, and you can see him start assing with the tone control. He's either putting it back on for after Moby Dick, or he's undoing it before Moby Dick. But you can really hear that. I mean, it's pretty, it's interesting. Like with Alex Van Halen, he really loved those 6.5 by 14 Supras. And while he really, really taped up, he used to put a lot of gaffer's tape on the top head. Tuning is very, I think, like the pitch of the heads, apart from maybe how much the top head is muffled, is very similar to Bonham's too. It might not be as high as Bonham's, but anyway, I'm still sort of ringing from that. It is interesting, like, what is the big deal about the gear? That even in and of itself would be a good book, man. You could kill two birds with one stone. You could talk about the gear proper, but then you could almost talk about like what drives people to be so interested in the gear that this frickin' guy played for 11 years. You know what I mean? There's like no second runner-up. I mean, the second runner-up I think would be Stuart Copeland. Mm-hmm. But again, and he's still alive. Like if he wasn't alive and no one knew where his gear was, it would probably be the same thing. But yeah, it's head and shoulders, miles above the rest. it just really is interesting. And especially as more time goes by, like George and I were invited to go see Jason Bonham play. They played at in Indiana a year and a half ago. It was last year, or the year before. So we drove out over there and saw it, and they had as the Jimmy Page, that Jimmy Sakurai. Do you know Jimmy Sakurai?
I don't know him.
Or of him. He's a Japanese, a fella, musician who really, really loves Zeppelin and really loves Jimmy Page stuff. And he's just like the guru of Jimmy Page. You know, he's probably like his idol and everything. But so Sakurai was playing with Jason Bonham. And what had happened was I had originally, a few months or a year or something before, I had sent a video to, not even, it might have been just a few months, of George playing Moby Dick. So I sent it. Well, God, what did I can't remember what I said. I can't remember what I sent him a few videos. I think I sent him a video of me playing Moby Dick, maybe a video of George playing. I to be honest, I can't remember. But what happened was I got an email back from Sakurai. He was, man, his jaw was, he was like, you got to put me in touch with this George. You know what I mean? So George then got the backstage pass. And I think George was like, listen, man, I'm not coming unless this guy comes. So we both went. But anyway, the cool thing was we got to meet Sakurai after the show, but we thought for sure we'd be able to meet Jason Bonham. But what happened was that whole show was interesting watching Jason Bonham play, because he kept going like this and he kept like grabbing his arms and stuff. And I thought he was having a heart attack or something.
Yeah.
And he played less and less fills and less aggressively. I guess he wasn't feeling good, so he went home. But man, if George and I could have gotten his ear just for like 5 minutes, I thought we would have had him in the bag. Like, Jason, you got to take us back to frickin' Birmingham, man. We're going to start rifling through all the closets and storage rooms that your dad had, you know, your mom and dad had over there. But the interesting thing is I remember reading an article on Jason Bonham, because I remember he sort of came in the early mid-'80s, he had a band called Bonham, right? But you could tell the way he played. He didn't play anything like the feel or the fills or anything. But he would come out and say, he's like, you know, I want to be known for I'm my own guy, you know, which is totally, that's cool as hell, you know. But I think like you said, there came a time maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, I think, where he did go back and really start looking at kind of, you know, what his dad did. Like I remember him talking about in an article, maybe Modern Drummer or something, or I can remember it was a video article where he was talking about how, like, people asked him how he counted the intro to rock and roll. He's like, well, I don't know. You just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you play it, and then you add the 3/8 notes, and that's the way everybody else used to play it before you realized that it came in on like the and of 3.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Which is where those 8th notes go. But even he didn't know, you know, and it's interesting to even hear him talk. Like I read another article where he's talking about, it's like, yeah, and at the end of Trampled Underfoot, where my dad very briefly goes to the ride cymbal and then back to the hat. Little things like that he noticed, you know, which of course I know, you know, there's everybody, but he noticed that too, you know, as he went back and started to sort of peruse all his dad's stuff, you know. So, but yeah, even now though, even, you know, and that's part of the thing, like with Sakurai, I'm telling you, man, if you got Jimmy Sakurai in the same room with George, that's what I was telling George. I'm like, you get George and this guy Pete they have. So they will sit and they will play, they'll cover Led Zeppelin studio songs, but what they also do too is they'll play like let's call it like a 1972 version of Immigrant Song. So George has heard, all three of these guys have heard probably every recorded live version bootleg of Immigrant Song. So George might tell the guys, Ivan and Pete, and say, listen, so what we're going to do here, do you remember that thing where when they were in Helsinki and they did this? Yes. Remember that thing when they were in Berlin, they did this? Yeah. That thing in Tampa? Okay. He's like, I'm going to play one like that and I'll talk you through it. So then George goes, sits behind his frickin' drums by himself with no music, and will literally, like I was saying that maybe Bonham did possibly when they tracked, and sit and play for 7 minutes or 5 minutes, just the drums with this thing going in his head. So then he'll send that track off to Ivan or to Pete probably first with the bass, and say, all right, listen here. So, you know, Pete, what I did is that, you know, like the 1-4-3 mark, I'm doing, you know, the 4 bars there like they did in Tampa. So by the time Pete's done, puts his bass over it and Ivan puts his guitar over it, you listen to it, it sounds like a really good bootleg from a show you never heard. And there's two things that are amazing about it. Is not just the fact that they can play it, but even the manner in which they went through the machinery to get this done. George just played it in his head, made a few notes to Ivan and Pete, and Pete just, laid the stuff on top. You got to hear it, man. If you get a chance, type in PFOZ Immigrant Song, and it's just crazy. It sounds like a really, really good, almost like a bored studio mix of Zeppelin just jam. There's no vocals, but it's just out of hand, man. And again, like I said before, with George tuning the drum set, it's just crazy. But if you got Sakurai, though, if you got Sakurai on guitar and got George on drums and Pete on bass, man, you could take that around the country, man. And you get a club that might hold 500 people, and you're going to sit and you're going to jam Zeppelin all night, but you get a bunch of Zeppelin Bonham fans in there. You could do like questions asked, and somebody might say, hey, what are they, so you could sit and almost have like a John Bonham, Jimmy Page Zeppelin fest with music and chat. Man, you'd rake in the cash, I think, because somebody might say, hey, man, can you play that one part from, and then they just even bust into a minute of one of the songs. It'd be great to watch. So, but anyway, going back to, I was talking about Sakurai, that was going to be our doorway into possibly getting to Jason Bonham. But again, that didn't happen. It would be, and I got to tell you, still sitting here, man, I'm still thinking to myself that the whole concept of what makes Bonham's gear so freaking important. Like, for years and years, whenever I'd always look at the pictures of like the Thermoglass kit, the Maple kit, or the Green Sparkle kit, or the Amber kit, or the Stainless Steel. In almost every photograph of the Thermo kit, it just looked like the bass drum was deeper. Like whenever you saw pictures of the Stainless or the Amber or the Green Sparkle, it always looked like a 14 by 26. A 14 by 26 looks, you can just tell if it's a little deeper. But there was just always something about the Thermoglass, and I used to chalk it up sometimes. And it's techniques they use now, intentionally or unintentionally, where sometimes they'll squash the photograph a little bit. What I mean? Like you'll see everything just looks a little fatter, kind of. And I ended up just chalking it to that. But I remember in the early 2000s, probably 01 or 02, I found out that Paul Thompson had Bonham's Thermoglasses. So I found out Paul Thompson, the drummer for Roxy Music. So I sent him, he had this website, which he probably still has, where you could send him messages. I said, hi, Paul, my name's Terry. I'm in Chicago. Just curious about, Bonham's kit you have. And the question I asked him, I said, because I assumed that, well, maybe one was 26 by 14 and one was 26 by 16. So then I figured maybe sometimes he'd be out, he'd have the 16-inch depth, and other times he'd have, because there were some pictures where it did look more tuna canny. But I said, are they the same depth? I thought it'd be rude for me to ask him to measure them, because if he didn't know how to measure them, he might have to take that kind of shit.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
The same depth. He said yes. So that was the question I asked him. So I sort of blew my load in asking him that. That was sort of it. And so in videos I used to always say then, those bass drums got to be 16 inches deep, So I have videos where I play it up, the mystery of Bonham's, 16-inch deep Thermoglass bass drum. But what finally ended up happening is there's this fella, Billy Harrington, who I just met, that George I met recently, super nice guy, a great drummer. He wrote that article. There was an article in Modern Drummer about a year ago. He got a hold of Paul Thompson, because he had to go to England for something. So he's like, do you mind if I come down or come over there and interview you take pictures of this kit? And Paul Thompson's like, fine. So Billy Harrington goes over there and interviews and talks with Paul Thompson, takes a bunch of pictures of the drums, and sure enough, the bass drum measures 15 inches deep. It's not 14 and it's not 16. So, and apparently what happened was, and this is funny, what happened was apparently Carmine Appice used to play years ago. He had a leady bass drum, I guess, when he was growing up, that I think was 15 inches deep for some reason. So when he ordered his drums from Ludwig, ordered the bass drums to be 15 inches deep as opposed to 14 or 16. And in those days, in the 60s up through the early 70s even, a 16-inch deep bass drum was really rare. I think Louis Bellson used to get 16 or 18 or 20-inch deep bass drum, but it was unusual, almost by law, every bass drum up until the early mid 70s was probably 14-inch deep, and of course the story goes that Carmine Appice, and which is true, hooked Bonham up with an endorsement from Ludwig, and they pretty much gave Bonham an exact replica of Carmine's set, except that Carmine had a 12 by 15-inch rack tom, and Bonham ordered a 12 by 14, so it was this a 14-inch diameter. but then of course got the same depth bass drums, probably without even, Bonham himself probably didn't even notice,
Yeah.
And so they turned out to be 15-inch depth, which I'll tell you, man, thank God somebody got to the bottom of it because I was pulling my hair out. But the funny thing is that Carmine himself, we posted a discussion on Facebook that there's no way that the bass, we're like, look, those bass drums are definitely not 14 inches deep. And I always said they were 16 because I never, that'd almost be like calling a Fender in a certain way and saying, listen, I don't want an 18-inch speaker. Can I have an 18 and a half? But we were talking about it, and Carmine Appice commented on what George and I were saying and said something along the lines of, now this might sound a little more mean-spirited than it actually was, but something like, yeah, that guy doesn't know what he was talking about. Of course they were 14 inches deep, something like that. But of course it turns out that it was 15, and not only that, it was 15 because it was Carmine's were 15. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, man, it's just, the thing about the gear, that's really sticking with me. I never really thought of it that way, even with people with their guitars and stuff. The Bonham, there's definitely a documentary to be made.
Do you want to hop in on those 5 songs?
Yeah, let's pop those in and we'll see.
So let's see. The first one is going to be the song "I'm Gonna Crawl," and this is the last track off Through the Outdoor, or In Through the Outdoor, sorry, which is from 1979. Is that the last album of new songs? I mean, minus Coda, we'll talk about later, but was that their last album?
That was the last record they did, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, what about that song do you think has some Bonzo-isms?
Well, you can hear Bonham in there. I'm Gonna Crawl, it's really tasty because it's, in a certain way, it's a lot like, to me, even though it's 78, I guess, when they were recording it, it's a lot like the way he played in like 69 and 70. It's very similar, obviously, the kind of like, T for One, in a certain way, or Since I've Been Loving You, and he employs a lot of like those rolls, again, whether it's a fine, really finely played single stroke roll or a buzz roll, and he also does a thing where it's like boom, boom, ba, boom, ba, da, da, and I'm not really sure how he's playing. There's just little things that Bonham will do, and it's simple, but it sounds really cool, and it fits the exact spot of the song perfectly, and you're like, God, what did he play there? And again, then you have to rely on other people, well, I think he was doing this, or I think he was doing this. And again, it only lasts 3 seconds. It's not something he did 15 times. And that's part of the appeal of it, too, with I'm Gonna Crawl. Yeah, it's always like just enough, and it's never too much. And then some of those, right after the ba-na-na-da-da, boom, ba, boom, boom, boom. You know what I mean? He does that roll right in. And again, you're not sure if he's doing, because he would do buzzes sometimes. You can see, like at Robert Hall and stuff, when he's kind of doing, like the whipped cream buzz rolls, But he also, you can see him clearly in the early days doing those. Man, you got to check that. I'm sure you've seen it, Ben. If you check that out and you're like, oh, yeah, there it is. They're just single stroke rolls. The sticks are, they're going like this, but really fast. And it's just like the very end of that. It just very slightly hits the drum. It sounds like butter, man. And even George can kind of do it. George is like, yeah, he's like, he's like, I can give you my best rendition of it, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of drummers that probably could do it if they maybe tried, but there might be something to have to do with the way their hands are or something. Like it might almost be like a quirk. Because I've seen people that can play fast French rolls, and I ask them to do it, and they're like, they can do it, but they just can't do it lightly.
Did John have a famous teacher, or is it a well-known guy he studied with prior to joining the Yardbirds and like all that stuff?
Well, people always talk about in like a book or an article that there was one particular drummer who recalls taking lessons with him. And then there's another drummer, who could tell you this is Billy Harrington, because Billy really has done a lot of his homework. George could too. Like a lot of those kind of Zeppelin geeky things in my mind, because I'm 50 now, is stuff that was so fresh in my mind when I was 12. And now I kind of can't remember. But I think what was the name? George, like Alcock or something? Let me look that up. There was a drummer, I think, that he briefly studied with. Some people just have little quirks and they're able to just do certain things, which technically that if they took lessons earlier, they'd have been discouraged from doing. But yeah, okay, I got the drummer. His name's Gary Alcock. No, but anyway, so Gary Alcock, and I guess what he says, John Bonham struck up a friendship with fellow drummer who lived nearby called Gary Alcock, who might have had some influence. So you can find some of this stuff on like some Bonham pages and stuff. But I mean, I would say almost certainly that Bonham would have had. I think it's very, very seldom that you ever have a drummer, especially with how fast Bonham came along, who was so good kind of so soon. I'm sure there were teachers in there, because if you really had to totally with this pair of stick go through trial and error to get certain things so fluid, I don't think that really could happen. I mean, I'm sure it could happen. I mean, conceivably it could. I mean, but again, with like, Bonham, when you really listen to a lot of that stuff, like Moby Dick and the early Moby Dicks, solos and stuff, where you really hear him rely heavily on paradiddle diddles and paradiddles and singles and doubles and stuff. And he does. It's almost like he, because they always used to say, and I guess it's still held, like when I used to read these Zeppelin books when we were kids, it's like, well, Bonham got his first snare. They used to always say he got his first drum. His parents gave him a snare drum at 10, and then he got his first drum set when he was 16. So when you think about that, you're like, all right, so Bonham was 16 in 1964, right? So you're telling me, so if he got his first drum set in 1964, but in 1968, 4.5 years later, he's playing like that on these records, that's pretty intense, man.
Yes.
But it's cool to say, though, that if he in fact did have a snare drum, let's say between the time, let's say that, what would it be if you're 58 to 64, and he was maybe that whole time just practicing like old school straight up, not like Radamacus and stuff or Lesson 25 or whatever, but was really doing a lot of paradiddles, double paradiddles, paradiddle diddles, singles, buzzes, that type, maybe flam, Swiss triplets or whatever. I mean, that's what it really seems like maybe for, 10, whatever it was, 6 years. That's maybe he really, really just did. And then when he got the drum set, really was like, well, I'm going to do those rudiments around the toms and stuff. Because when you really watch those Moby Dicks, that's really what if you really watch him, he's just kind of doing rudiments and very tastefully, not just haphazard, but around the drums. That's kind of like the whole vibe of Bonham. And again, what I call that thing, the Bonham engine, I couldn't think of another word to put it. I guess it came where, when you hit with you're doing singles with your arm. So right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. Well, simultaneously you're doing singles with your foot, but you're doing left, right, left, right, left, right. Mm-hmm. So your right hand is hitting at the same time as your hi-hat. If you had two bass drums, it would be your left bass drum, right? And then if your left arm hit hit whatever you're hitting, and then your right foot hit. So it's a cross thing. Like when you run, when you're running or you're walking, when your right arm is out, your left leg is out. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So just for so really the Bonham engine is how you'd almost be running sitting at a drum set. But yeah, I just, but the thing about the Bonham engine is the thing that I love so much about it. I'll tell you, man, you sit and you play the Bonham engine pretty fast for 5 minutes, you burn some calories, bro. I want to make some videos. I was going to make like a joke video where I set the drums up here and maybe I dress up. And it's so funny. I was going to dress up actually like Richard Simmons. Remember Richard Simmons?
Yeah.
Okay, and I was going to put a big wig on. I was take like a sock or something and stick it, and be like, hi, everybody, and then sit and do the Bonham engine and sweat my ass off and be like, but it's so funny. We were out to dinner just like 2 or 3 months ago, and my wife, we have these friends. And it was funny because we're at dinner and she starts talking about that, because I would talk about how you could, market a drum set as like a health device, not just physical, but also mental. It's, drums have been around 50,000 years or whatever. Yep. And it's so funny. She said the same thing. She's like, you should dress up, like Richard said. And I thought to myself, like, man.
All right. So that was the I'm Gonna Crawl from In Through the Outdoor. Number 2 is In the Light, which is track 7 off Physical Graffiti. And that was released 1975.
The neat thing about that song is that sort of, in a certain way, In the Light sort of, in a certain way, it's almost like a predecessor of sort of like In Through the Outdoor, because that synthesizer that's on there and stuff. But what Bonham, specifically with Bonham, that's a classic Physical Graffiti drum sound. Like that room, boom, boom, boom. But when you hear the way that Bonham will sort of play over the bar a little. So he'll be like, dum bum ba 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 bum 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 bum. You know what I mean? That's very Bonzo, and he doesn't do it. He doesn't beat it to death 1,000 times. But he also does something interesting in there, which is classic Bonham, where Bonham, like, he almost breaks up even though the pulse of the tune is going. God, it's hard for me to describe this. I always try to figure out a better way to describe it. do you know, like in very heavy music, very heavy, like Wagnerian German music, like, you know, sometimes in that musical culture, they want to surprise you and shock you. That's kind of the whole thing, like, you know, like when you watch those German TV shows, sometimes and they're wearing like leather and everything's, you know, so like sprockets, like so like Stefan from like Saturday Night Live.
Yes.
There's the German way about stuff, you know. But it's almost like Bonham's drumming in a certain way had like that kind of a general mojo. But there's a fill he does like boom 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 boom, and he like intentionally comes out of it just a teeny bit early to make it almost sound like something's falling down. You know when something falls down a flight of stairs? And if it might almost sound musical for a minute, like boom, 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 boom. But at the very end, it goes like that.
Oh, yeah.
Bonham actually reproduces that on the drums. It's really interesting. That's a classic Bonham thing to do, too. And then when he comes back in on the crash, he's right on the downbeat. So it's not necessarily really something that's even rushed. And he either intentionally does it from beginning to end or realizes it occurs on almost like right before the fade out. But yeah, that is a great example of at least one particular era of Bonham sound, which is really the physical graffiti sound. You know, you hear that on In My Time of Dying, you hear it on In the Light. But there is some stuff on physical graffiti that I think are holdovers from earlier records, Down by the Seaside and Houses of the Holy, the song and stuff like that. But there really is just like a big, what is the name of the house? Headley Grange. They used to go to Headley Grange and they'd record there, you know, where they did like When the Levee Breaks. And
that big hall, yeah.
That big hall, you know, and I think it's funny. The funny thing about that, whenever I used to listen to Misty Mountain Hop as well as When the Levee Breaks, I can't help but think that Misty Mountain Hop was also recorded in that same stairwell, if you kind of listen to it. Even though and this happens all the time in the Bonzolian videos that I'll put, you know, people say, you know, Terry, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, all that ambience came from the stairway. You know, there aren't any effects on it. And I'm like, well, there are, you know, they're heavily compressed, and they used a thing like they used, what do they call it? A Benson, an echo rack or something. So there is like a tape. It's a tape delay. You know, they used to call it like a, you know, where the record head and the play head are here, right? Like they used, like I think somebody at Abbey Road, I think originally developed it for the Beatles to give them like to thicken up the, you know what I mean? So it'll record and then immediately play back real close. So you get, listen, instead of having to physically double your vocal, it's the one vocal and everything, and just slightly, that's where that delay comes from.
Sure.
But they used to do it with the tape. And although I think maybe the Benson might have had I don't know if there was a tape in it, if it was like a spring or something. But yeah, man, it's people always would be like, so then what I finally did is I found a page online where you hear Andy Johns talking about what he did. So I would just sometimes just copy and paste the whole 18 paragraphs or whatever. And then the reply in a Bonzo video, I just hit paste to be like, here it is. But yeah, you have that Headley Grange era, and that song In the Light really kind of showcases. I think it's one of the best sounding, cleanest sounding of that physical graffiti room, in addition to the drum, you know, the fills that he puts on there and playing over the bar and stuff. You know, there's a lot of ideas I'll have for Bonzolium that I'll be laying in bed one night, and I'll be laying there like, oh my God, that's a great idea, I should do it, and then I'd forget. Or other times George and I'll be making videos, we'll be doing stuff at his place or here, and I'll think, oh, we should make a video on this or that, and then I forget. You could have videos on like Bonham specific fills, and then like light fills, or you know, there's like just little teeny things, you know, he does, like he used to love doing a thing with his hi-hat, like an All My Love. You know, All My Love off that same record where it's like, it starts the second verse. He leads it with an open hi-hat close. He used to do stuff like that, mostly live. You almost never heard it studio. I think that might even be the only time he does it. But yeah, the little Bonzoisms. Have you ever tried doing the Bonham engine where you hit your right hand? Try that, because most right-handed drummers, you'll want to hit the right at the same time as your foot. So you'll have the whole side of your body go, it's like boom, bum, bum, bum. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when people sometimes say the Bonham triplet, usually they're talking about, you know, around the drum set where you hit the left on the tom, or one hand on the tom, another one on the tom, and the bass drum. So boom, 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 boom.
Yep.
But I think most right-handed people or drummers find it more natural. They find it easier to lead with the right hand to go into the left. So right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. Whereas Bonham used to play it left, right, left, right, left, right. And I happen to do too. And you just notice it makes a teeny bit of a difference just by the nature of the way the drum set's laid out. because the rack tom's on the left side, it's a lot easier for your left hand to hit that tom in the snare, and your right hand, the floor tom just right there. That's how you kind of get like the descending. Otherwise, you won't get you'll get an ascending if you're the triplets the other way. Boom, bum, boom, bum, versus boom, boom, boom,
Yeah. All right, so number 3, and so this is actually a record I didn't know existed. It's Coda. The song's Darlene, which is track 6 off Coda, which is, as it's described, a rarities compilation released 2 years after Bonzo's death in 1982. And this one, I can't for the life of me understand why this wasn't released as an actual song, because this is such a good groove.
It really is. Well, the neat thing that I like about, one of the things I like about Darlene is, when the song goes and then he goes to the fast part, and then he does that fill in there. He's like, da, 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 da,
I'm referencing that, yeah.
Oh my God, buttons. That's something Bonham used to do. He used to love to play a triplet between his right hand, going back and forth between the hi-hat and the snare, or another drum, and then the foot. So like a dotted, like 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a boom. So Darlene's a great example in Bonzenberg because of, just the way his drums sound there. They sound great. It's a classic Bonham groove. But then when they do that transition into that swingy thing and the fills he puts in there and stuff, it's just really nice. That's just another sort of a nice thing that, that after people sort of get into Zeppelin stuff, they can kind of go over there and check that out too. What are the other tunes I gave you that we could look at? Do you remember the...
Yeah. There's the other two are No Quarter, the live version, and then Dazed and Confused live.
Oh my God. Okay. Yes. No Quarter. Now, when I say live version, it's almost like 25 years ago, in the sense that when I would say like No Quarter live version, that's kind of the only live version people had, unless you were a diehard Zeppelin person. You'd be like, well, I have, the one from Earl's Court, or the one from, oh my God, the one on the 77 tour from, Albuquerque or whatever. But, the neat thing about, there's a couple things to be said real fast. Just strictly speaking, in anything you hear from the Madison Square Garden stuff on the album or in the movie, Jimmy Page, he cobbled together those performances. I mean, that's just show you how, solid Bonham was and stuff. Like if you look at certain songs, like even like The Dazed Confused that's on that record, they have 20, I think, isn't it like a half hour long? It's pretty long. There's like 8 pieces from the second night, 9 pieces from the first, and then he just put it together. But the ending piece, but typically what had happened there is like any beefy part where like Page would be soloing or they'd really get into a cool part would be kept in its entirety, I think, from a night. I think what they do is they'd say, all right, well, let's just take the intro from another, you know what I mean? Maybe, Plant was singing out of tune or something. But I'll tell you that No Quarter live that you find, again, it's very important that you find the 12-minute version. There's there's a version where Page has edited out for the past 20 years and all these remasterings and stuff he's done. He's taken the part out. But it's just great playing between, Bonham used to play with Page. Like, it's almost like Bonham would follow Page and John Paul Jones would follow Bonham. And you'd really, and Keith Moon used to do that with Pete Townsend too. Pete played differently and stuff, wasn't really a solo person. But Moon used to kind of follow Pete Townsend too. And but you really hear that on No Quarter, just that vinyl version. If you find that original version on the Song Remains the Same soundtrack, it's just the way Bonham is playing along with Page. And then as the tune kind of goes on, he does a bunch of really interesting stuff with the bass drum and the hi-hat. Like it's almost kind of, it's funk. You'd call it like a funk sort of like, but a taste, not like stereotypical like doon dun doon dun doon dun. So not necessarily much like a beat displacement. It's sort of like a weird sort of like boogie woogie with his right foot in the snare and the hi-hat going with the foot, almost like little sort of dances. The No Quarter is a really great example of that. Bonham had a really cool thing that he'd sort of do little pretty pieces between the bass drum, the snare, and the hi-hat, like little sort of like, and it wouldn't last very long. And you kind of be like, wait, what did he play there? And it usually would involve the hi-hat opening a little bit in sort of a disco type way. Like,
yep.
But it predated disco and it didn't sound disco-y. But he just, like, he used to love to do a thing where he would hit 2 bass drum notes softly, like a flutter with an open hi-hat, like boom, 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 boom. And it was like a little sort of dance boogie. And he employs the shit out of that in that no quarter. You'd hear him he does a lot of that in a particular time as the song goes on. They kind of go into that segment. But yeah, so wait, and then I also said Dazed and Confused live. Zeppelin used to take a few of their numbers, as they'd say, and really extend them out. So what they would do with Dazed and Confused and with How Many More Times is they'd really, and No Quarter was one, they'd really extend out. They'd have these big, massive like pieces, like solos, I guess you'd say. Even at that time, and even now, there's a lot of bands that go out on stage and they're just going to play what's on the record. But hey, we're playing it live. We might extend it a little bit, or we might change a couple words. Where Led Zeppelin would play like, they'd go out and they'd do like the intro and the outro, but they totally just jam the song in front of 30,000 people. You know what I mean? And it's funny. I'm sure there's been times in my life I played with certain musicians. You play with certain people like they hear stuff the same way, like they have the same sense of time, and again, like sometimes moving the time a little, speed it up or slow it down here, like it's almost natural. It's not something. It's something that pre-exists that they're picking up on. And I think there's a lot of clips where you see like Zeppelin live. You'll see a lot of photographs of Zeppelin playing, especially in the earlier days, where you see John Paul Jones and he'll be looking at Bonzo while he plays. Like there's even an article where John Paul Jones talks about he used to just watch Bonham's bass drum. He'd sit and he'd stand there and just watch Bonham as he played, like because he could tell if he was going to do maybe another pattern or something too, and he could, But there really is nothing. I'll tell you, a live show where Zeppelin were on, even where they were moderately on fire, is unbelievable. But some of those shows where they're just killing it, I mean, I don't know, man. It's it's an interesting. Seriously, it's an interesting thing. Seriously, it would have been really neat to see what would have happened if Bonham didn't pass away. And he played drums all through the 80s and the 90s if nothing happened. There's certain musicians, it's the way they play. Like a Steve Gadd, even though he doesn't play with Bonham, Steve Gadd has like his own way of playing. Jimmy Page has his own way of playing. Eric Clapton has their own way of playing. There's just like a certain way people do their instrument, like their personality, their temperament comes out in it. You know what I mean? Bonham, I think, was a very deliberate person who just didn't like to be rushed. Like Stuart Copeland, or there's certain people that really, if they kind of talk faster and they're very type A and they like to move fast, they're probably more likely to rush a song. Not necessarily speed the thing up, but what I'm saying is I think they're more likely to at each beat maybe slightly play ahead of the beat. Like if you had a room full of people, like in the Queen thing, like. Well, I guarantee you, if when you listen to that, it's like a bell curve. You have some people clapping early, some people clapping on. So it goes. So the boom boom clap goes, and that's the people clapping a little early and clapping late. I guarantee in Bonham probably would have been one of the people right on or just slightly behind. Where I know naturally with me, I'd be somebody who'd probably be very slightly ahead.
Me too.
Because it reflects your general personality. When you play. But that really is the beauty that really is Bonham, and indeed Zepp. It was such a really neat, to have John Paul Jones, who's really such a talented bass musician, arranger, keyboard player, and then you have Jimmy Page, who's such a talented musician, guitar player, and then you had Bonham. It's so funny. I talk to so many people now who I didn't realize how even amongst Zeppelinites, there's so many people who really could kind of take or leave Plant.
Really?
Oh, totally. There's a lot of people who are like, yeah, and then you have Plant. But I mean, I love Plant. I mean, Plant to me was, the icing on the cake. The way his voice sounded. Nobody else ever sounded like Plant, or still. So it's almost like with all those guys, you have nobody that sounded like. You have nobody that really ever really sang like Plant. Truly, nobody that ever played the drums like Bonham. There's not a lot of people that can play. I mean, Jimmy Page has, like that type of loose. Even in. Jimmy Page, when he was on fire on a night, it wasn't necessarily any fast skill. It was just the way that he'd bend the notes and this way he'd go. So it wasn't even so much his ability to physically play the instrument as what his brain and musicality was doing with it. And that's the same like with Bonham too. It just really was like 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = infinity. The only Led Zeppelin song to me where I ever hear anything that is maybe slightly un-Bonham-y. It's on the second record. It just rushes a little bit unusually. It's Tangerine. It doesn't sound defective or anything, But as it goes, ba ba na 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 ba 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 na, it almost sounds like a take where we're almost like they meant to take one or two after that, but they just took that. You know what I mean? It's just, but there's never a point in any Zeppelin song to me where Bonham does something where I feel like he's doing it in the wrong spot. Like it's just enough, like we were saying, like he'll have a cool. It's not complicated. It's something simple. It fits the music at that exact moment, and he just did it. Like you said, he made the choice to do it at that one time. Like one thing that stands out like that is if you listen to the beginning of Achilles' Last Stand, the guitar fades in it. Boom, bum, ba, 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 na, 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 boom, ba, 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 na, 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 na. And as the fade comes in, you hear Bonham tap on his 18-inch bell, the bell of his 2002. He goes, da, na, na, he hits 3 taps. Da, na, na, ting, ting, ting. And it only does it that one time. And it's just next time you notice it, you hear him just tap it. And you can hear a slight delay on it. It's like, it's just classic Bonham. He just does it that one time. He doesn't do it on the outro. He doesn't do it 10 times. It's just that one little thing, man.
And that's the show. If you're listening on a platform that allows ratings and reviews, do that. It helps more people find the show, so it'll get bigger and better, and hopefully I'll have a chance to sell out one day. But you'll be an OG listener that can brag to all your friends. Anyways, why don't you go and check us out at bigfatsnaredrum.com and follow us on all the socials. Just search for Big Fat Snare Drum and you will find us. The show is edited in part using iZotope RX Audio Editor. It's amazing, so go check that out at iZotope.com. And thanks again to Gunnar Olsen for the theme music. Bye.
Your call has been forwarded to voicemail.
Hi, this is Zoe Deutsch.
And Nick Robinson. Our brand new movie, Voicemails for Isabel, is all about those little moments that feel like the universe is looking out.
Feeling homesick, then your sister calls.
Hearing that perfect song exactly when you need it. Sometimes life rigs things in our favor, like learning about your new favorite rom-com, Voicemails for Isabel. Now playing only on Netflix.
I'm Serena Williams, and I'm healthier on Ro. I've lost 34 pounds in a year with GLP-1s, diet, and exercise. On Ro, you can access GLP-1 options, including the first FDA-approved GLP-1 pill for weight loss. Go to ro.co/journey to see if you qualify. 14 to 20% average weight loss in 1 year in non-diabetics with obesity or overweight with a weight-related medical condition versus 2.2% to 3.1% in placebo arm. RX only. To stay informed about serious side effects, go to ro.co/safety.